Today we have a speaker that will talk about his own experiences with how governments use legislation and taxation to nudge or to force change towards sustainability. So this is a practitioner report. Unfortunately, our speaker will have to leave around 6 o'clock. And so we are a little bit under time pressure. He got a invitation by CEO, obviously something that he could not refuse. And so we appreciate the time that he will have with us. Our speaker today is Simeon Thompson. He's Director of Finance of Specialties and Advanced Materials at Sun Chemicals. He has worked in various roles of Director of Finance and CFO in the aviation industry, in logistics. He was a managing consultant at Deloitte and Arthur Andersen. From an educational background, he's an engineer. Well, he studied engineering and management at the University of Exeter, and then obtained an MBA at the Imperial College in London. He is a black belt, a Lean Six Sigma black belt, a chartered accountant. And if that's not enough, he's also a rugby coach and referee. So well-rounded, and we are looking very much forward to his insight in his experiences with governments nudging towards sustainability with taxation and regulation. Simeon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Armin. That is a very generous introduction. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Is that happening?
There is I see a big black overlay.
Okay, so now it should be there.
Now I see a small black overlay. Now a very small black overlay.
Ah, okay. It says I'm sharing my screen.
Okay, so there's just like a small part of it is missing. Now it's bigger part that's missing. So now it's even bigger.
So can you see this? Can you see the slides or not?
Most of the slides, yes. I would say 95%.
Most of the slides.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll try that. So thank you for the introduction. I am intending to give you an introduction only. I will say that I am not an expert in this area, so I'm hoping to give you about 20 minutes, a bit of a background about sustainability and how it's getting driven, a little bit about COP, and then we'll start with the UK implementation so that you can understand some of the specifics about that, and then I'll try to give you a flavor for how the rest of the world is addressing it, and then what's coming next. And I've just put down at the bottom that it's 2023 data, so one of the things we'll cover is the fact that this is a very fast-moving area, and so you need to keep up to speed with it, and it can have a big impact on a number of organizations. So that's the purpose of the call. So COP stands for the Conference of Parties, and it's essentially an organization that comes together on an annual basis to drive the climate agreements, and after each COP there is a kind of an agreed upon statement which ideally the participants will agree to be bound by. I've put up here specifically about the Paris Agreement on the basis that was a real sort of line in the sand, if you like, in 2015, in that after that there was a legally binding kind of contract that the parties, 196 countries essentially, had agreed to be bound by, and their focus was to limit the global warming by 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. So they're kind of legally bound to address that. And in terms of how they're actually doing that, then obviously there's initiatives in terms of renewables and energy and so on. But some of the impacts for business are quite dramatic. We had at the previous FENG meeting discussions about some of the disclosure requirements that companies are having to go through, and that's what led into this presentation. So in terms of the UK, So we've got EPR and packaging regulation that are the topics that I'll cover. So plastic tax, okay? So this was essentially an effort by the British government or the UK government to introduce a tax to try and force the use of recycled plastic. So the tax that they brought in was at £210.82 per tonne, and that is on something that costs about £450 a tonne. So that's quite significant in terms of its impact. So there were some specific requirements in terms of who it would apply to and what the impacts were. But essentially, they're trying to force companies to use recycled plastic by making it significantly price restraining or constraining if they don't do that. So the requirement was to have 30% recycled plastic by weight that would be included alongside new plastic to create then this recycled content, if you like. So then that led into this new concept, which some of you may have heard of, extended producer responsibility. And this is essentially a kind of a follow-on from plastic tax. But what it does is create a requirement on packagers or people who are retailers who are kind of responsible for putting packaging into, well, I guess into the environment, that they have to declare what it is that they are putting into circulation, and particularly what it is that is recycled content. And if you think about a packager or, you know, an Amazon or a Walmart or you know, one of these large retailers, actually tracking that data in terms of the recycled content of some of their packaging is actually really hard. They don't necessarily know if they're, say, taking a product from an alternative or a third-party supplier, what the content is. And it creates a massive issue for them. And in terms of how it would be implemented, there would be these eco-modulated fees. So fees based on the material type and packaging format. And then they could be twisted to promote the idea of the eco-design. But they would also have a requirement to declare to the government what it was that they were putting into the marketplace, and therefore what fees were liable to be paid. So this was a big step change. So as a UK-wide approach, would expect the full net costs to be borne by producers, brand agents, retailers. This data submission was a big topic. So it could be biannual for large organizations and annual for small organizations. But the intention would be that it would go to a monthly declaration. So that, for a smaller organization, that would mean that you have to be aware of what exactly you've sold at a particular point in time, what the recycled content was of it, and then what fee or tax you had to pay as a result. So this EPR is a topic that's being pushed into the world economy, essentially, driven by the kind of the COP legal requirements, and then governments trying to work out how to address this. And essentially, as for us working in industries, we have to be aware of this because it's a topic that either our companies are going to have to kind of understand and address, or potentially our clients, or even us as consumers will have to kind of be aware of it, because there's going to be more cost associated depending what type of packaging you're using or buying, essentially. So in terms of the timeline for how this was organized by the UK, so 2022 was when the plastic tax was implemented, 23 was when ERP phase 1, 24 phase 2, and in phase 2, that was the intended date when we would have to, or the producers would start paying their fees. And then by 2030, report on recycling targets, and the aim would be a recycling rate of 70%. This is a seismic shift in terms of what it is that the producers are being asked to do, and also a very tight timeline. Now, it has slipped, that is true. We're not quite there, but the intention is still valid, and the goals have not changed. The implementation timeline has. So what does that mean in terms of potential cost? So the cost of setting this up was expected to be £2.7 billion that the government would essentially take from producers. So that's the scale of the tax that they're going to implement, and also, you know, look at companies to put on to consumers. So you can understand why some of it's been delayed, because we're in a cost of living crisis and so on. So obviously that's kind of not going to help in these tough times. So that's the UK, and a kind of summary of that. But it's not only in the UK. As I said, COP has been adopted by over 190 countries. So the EU has its own approach and its own regulations and EPR, sorry, which I'll try to give you a flavour of. But as you can see from the UK model, there's a lot of complexity, and that's another topic. If you work in a global business or a multinational, this is really an impact that you need to be aware of in terms of how each of the different countries is addressing it. So European Union, the plastic tax, and then packaging directives, aiming here for the same target, 70% recycling by 2030. And then this single-use plastic ban, so plastic bags and things like that. I think we've already all seen those either being charged or pushed out of the marketplace, marking requirements, and so on. And then we go into, so that was a European-wide topic, but then in France, they've got EPR with specific dates. So 100% recycling rate was intended by 2025. That was their kind of ambition. And a French plastic pact, looking at 30% average recycled content overall, but specifically for packaging, 100% recycled. And again, seismic shifts happening or being pushed for. In the Netherlands, so they have an EPR standard framework already in place, but then they have some other topics coming on top. The plastic pact, again, looking at 20% overall consumption reduction for plastic packaging. These are big industries that are being squeezed by this. It does have an impact for all this. So the cost implementation implications in the EU, and again, staggering numbers. In France, they were looking at 1.3 billion, Germany 1.3 billion, close to $1 billion for Italy and Netherlands and so on. Again, significant tax, but it's viewed as a low cost and as inevitable tax rather than an incentive to improve. It's something that just has to happen if you're going to use these products which are damaging to the environment. The US is even one country, but it's got its own complexities within it. So they had this Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act introduced in the Senate in 2021. And then there was this bottle bills by state. And so that was intended as a similar to a deposit return scheme that we have here in Europe. But then the EPR was going to be legislated by state with a number of different sort of schemes alongside it. But this gives you a picture. If you're trying to serve the US marketplace, so you've got the green states there where they've approved the extended producer responsibilities, and you've got the yellow states where that's been proposed, but then you've got the red states where essentially they've said no. So if you're a supplier, say Walmart, trying to serve the US, you've got different legislation requirements different requirements in terms of reporting, tax to pay, and so on, that vary by state. The level of complexity, if you're going to serve consumers in these marketplaces, is significant. So the cost implications in the US. So the deposit return scheme for the bottle bills was estimated to be $3 billion. And then we've got some figures by state in terms of how much the costs were likely to be. 803 million in New York State in direct cost, and then indirect in terms of other costs associated with it, nearly 4 billion on the New York State economy alone. So significant costs that are being pushed into the business or into the economy. And I've just highlighted there UK, EU, and the US, but even in the rest of the world, with those 197 participants in COP, we've got Australia doing a similar topic, and even in China, they've been taking on board the requirements and looking at the way that packaging is sold. There are some significant implications globally, as I mentioned, in terms of costs and so on. But there's more stringent things coming down the line: higher fees for less sustainable options, mandatory recycling and marking, more stringent packaging legislation so that you won't be able to put your products into the market if the packaging isn't in line with the requirements. So some takeaways: this is coming. It's not something that we can avoid. The EPR is going to happen. So in terms of how it impacts us, research. It's important. Planning for it. We need to change the way that we have packaging. Otherwise, you could be punished. So there could be cost implications. And this live packaging data, the requirements to report on a monthly basis is going to create a different sort of context in which we operate in. We've got our ERP systems today looking at what we should manufacture, but then we need to have an EPR system that's going to then looking at what we sold and what the plastic content was and those kinds of things. So the more you can get ready for this, the better.
Wow, that's quite overwhelming.
I just want to bring you back to this, okay? So this is what happened as a result of the plastic tax in the UK. So unintended consequences, right? So new plastic costs about £450 a ton. Recycled plastic costs about £1,300 a ton. So what's going on now is that legislation is being brought in so that plastic, if it gets put into a bottle, for example, it actually has to be used. Because right now what's happening is people are making bottles, they're not filling them, and then they're sending them to recycling. And then putting that with new bottles and kind of saying, well, we've met the 30% requirements because we want, and so we want to avoid that plastic tax. But that was never the intention. The intention was that they'd be collecting used plastic to put in alongside new plastic. But the costs at the moment are just kind of prohibitive. So the market is coming up with, recycled plastic that's not been used. So that was all I wanted to do, just give a high level oversight, and hopefully that's been helpful. Are there any questions?
Just one question. When you say EPR, extended producer responsibility, so that's a UK law, but there are similar laws in other countries. That's when you say EPR in the US. So you mean there's something similar, or they adopted the same law?
No, it's entirely separate. So in the US, each state has its own legislation. Okay. That's the level of complexity that we're trying to address and kind of contemplate. Needless to say, the reason I know something about this is on the basis that one of the businesses that's in my portfolio as finance director, is a consulting business that's really trying to help our clients solve these challenges. So if anybody does need an introduction, then I can certainly arrange that. Do look me up on LinkedIn and send me an email or get in touch. No problem.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was fascinating. Any other questions?
I had a question on impact on the finance function specifically. So, to what extent would you say the finance function is involved or should be involved? Where do you see, you know, in terms of the data, the reporting, or even the, you know, strategic planning in terms of compliance, non-compliance? From a finance function perspective, what do you see?
Yeah, well, I think it's an important point to me. The reality is it's gonna impact all aspects of the business, especially, you know, if you're a consumer-facing business, and even if you're selling to other businesses, the packaging that you create or the chemicals that you produce, or the manufacturing process that you go through, it's all going to be in some way or shape ending up with a consumer that will need to be reporting on it. So the kind of the level of information that you put out about the recycled content is going to need to be a red thread through all aspects of the supply chain, and to contemplate that finance wouldn't be involved in that as a process, you know, it's not logical. Finance is going to be a critical part and a critical player, even if it's just contemplating the different impacts on your business model and trying to figure out how you're going to, you know, work out how to pay the tax and all of those aspects.
Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they want to ask Simeon?
I have one that's somewhat chemical in nature. I'm a chemist by training. When I heard like 30% mandated recycling content, I had like red lights going on all over, because say you make a plastic packaging for some food and you have recycled content in there, you never know what is in the recycled content. So you can have all sorts of pollutants that are in the plastic that can seep into the food. Are there any exceptions for those kind of cases?
So food packaging is obviously critical. Some of the things that we're doing at the moment is actually creating coatings. So you can have the plastic with a thin coating on the top, so that when you go into recycling process, the coating then releases the plastic, so that the plastic kind of remains pure underneath. But it's a real issue, and the reality is the governments and so on, they're kind of, it's not my problem. Your industry, you go and solve those issues. I understand they're very significant, but you need to fix those. You're smart guys, you'll come up with ways of dealing with it. One of the other things, the projects that we're working on is actually an invisible barcode that you print on a plastic, so that you know what the content is, and then that invisible barcode stays with it as it goes through your recycling center, so that you know, well, this plastic is on, you know, this is 70% recycled content already, whereas this is virgin or new. The mind boggles when you try to contemplate the complexity.